Okay, welcome. So we're going to start off today with the masterclass, which is about one of my favourite topics, which is about the inner critic. And so I want to start with talking about a coachee that I've been working with the last couple of weeks in particular. So she went for a CEO role in her organization about 2 years ago, and she didn't get the role, and she really struggled with her mind afterwards, which is a reason why she connected with me and we started doing coaching together. Her mind would play the interview over and over again, and wasn't very kind to her. And we call this part of the mind our inner critic. So that part of us that likes to remind us of the things that we've done wrong, and likes to kind of disaster movie about the future. And things to really notice about that voice that we have in our mind is that it can get into a very black and white place. So it can get into a very like you are or I am. So it's very kind of definite. It's very factual. It feels like it's very factual. It's very much like I'm telling you the truth. It tends to generalize. So it tends to kind of take one instance. Oh, that thing didn't go well for you, so everything's going to go wrong for you. It loves a bit of comparison. So you're not as good as that person. And so one of the tricks that we use or methods that we use around the inner critic is to name it. So that can be really helpful in a sense of kind of giving it a persona. So for this client, she named her inner critic Eeyore. And her inner critic was very much like the character of Eeyore. And was very much kind of like, oh, what's going to go wrong next? And I don't know, that very like that worst case scenario thinking. And she has an interview today for another CEO role in a different organization. And so we were working together last week. And some of the things that Eeyore was coming up with were, how will you cope if you don't get this job? You're going to mess it up again. Maybe you're not good enough. So Eeyore was having a bit of a field day with the preparation for this interview and was showing his true style with my client. And I'm going to come back to this client at the end to kind of close the circle and tell you about what we did specifically about Eeyore. But what I want to think about now is that inner critic in general. So I like to think of the inner critic as a part of us that is a bit like a safety focused robot. So it's a part of us that is very much focused on keeping us safe. It's not the part of us that is worried about us living a meaningful and full life. It's about the bit that's about avoiding bad stuff happening. So it gets very kind of caught into replaying that kind of stuff that went wrong in the past, that we don't want to repeat again, and then projecting into the future and worrying about what might happen in the future. But it's very much connected to, I guess, the part of the brain that our ancestors, would have had around trying to protect us from imminent danger, our fight or flight system. And if you think about dangers for our ancestors, a lot of them were about belonging in their group. And so when we listen to the chat of our inner critic, a lot of it is about avoiding rejection from a group. And so I think even that starting point of understanding that it has a purpose, that it's trying to do something positive for us, and yet it often does it in a way that is really unpleasant and not particularly helpful. One thing that can be really helpful in order to live with your inner critic is to notice the stories that it tends to tell about us. So what it can help to do with a client is to identify what the story might be behind those different things that our inner critic tends to tell about us. Because what we find with thoughts is that we repeat the same thoughts over and over again. So 90% of the thoughts you're going to have today will be thoughts that you had yesterday. So looking for those stories can be really helpful, because these stories tend to be quite enduring. They can last for many years. So maybe there is an "I'm not clever enough" story. Or maybe it's I always say stupid things in front of important people. Maybe it's, I have this one, the "I'm a failure" narrative. Maybe it's an "I'm not good at public speaking" story. Maybe it's the "I'm a bad parent" script. Or it might be the "I am fat" narrative. And this is one that I have struggled with my whole life. Is my mind likes to tell me that I'm fat, that I'm overweight. What do you think happens when I get really connected with that story? So pop in the chat, what do you think that I want to go and do when I get really connected with, and I really feel like my mind is telling me a true story that I am fat? What do you think I want to go and do? Eat. Thank you, Joe. Exactly. So the thing that I want to do at that point is not something that actually takes me away from the thing that my mind is trying to protect me from. It actually takes me closer to the thing that it's worried about, which is really, really fascinating about fusing. And if you think about any of the stories that our minds tell us, they are when we fuse with them, when we really connect with them, when they feel really close to us and they feel really true, most often we will do things that are not in line with where we want to be. When we get caught up in the story, we end up, I think people talk about self-sabotage quite a lot. We end up doing things which don't actually take us to where we want to go. So although our mind is trying to keep us safe, what happens is we actually can make the thing happen that it's worried about through the way that we react when we really, really fuse with the story. The other thing that we can do is we can struggle with that story. So we can start, when those thoughts come up, like, oh, Hazel, you're a failure. I can start going, hey, no, I'm not a failure. No, look at all this evidence. Or I can be like, oh, I shouldn't be thinking like this. I'm a psychologist. I teach other people how to live with their mind. I shouldn't be feeling this, so I'm going to push it away. The problem with trying to push away or just telling our voice to stop it is that it can be a bit like quicksand, is that we give it power by giving it attention, and we can end up going down and down. And again, that can result in us fusing with it. So struggling often isn't helpful. The other thing that we often do is we distract ourselves. So we're feeling this painful kind of like, oh, I'm being quite mean to myself. And in order to cope with the emotion around it, we can reach for our devices, or reach for a glass of wine, or put the telly on and put on some reality TV. So often we can use distraction in order to cope with that kind of feeling, not enjoying these negative words. And again, distraction doesn't take us towards where we want to go. Distraction just distracts us for a moment and maybe makes us feel better in the short term, but it doesn't help us in the long term. So through acceptance and commitment therapy as a starting point, and working with clients over many years around coaching, I have an approach that I tend to use when the inner critic comes up. So firstly, I work with clients around noticing. So firstly, we'll be looking at, okay, it's really natural to have the inner critic come up, to have these stories come up in our mind. It's really, really natural. Everybody has them. And so I think there's something about normalizing it, that it's really normal. Don't worry about it. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you and something needs to be fixed. And noticing that the impact that story, when you connect with it, has on you. So that first stage is just really noticing, yeah, I'm noticing that those same thoughts are coming up. And I'm noticing that when they do come up, I tend to go and reach for my phone, or I tend to go and comfort eat in order to make myself feel better. So there's something around noticing to start off with. Then it can be helpful to name. So like with my client around Eeyore, giving the part of you that's coming up with those things a name can be helpful. Or giving the story a name can be helpful. So whether that's, like I say, the I'm a failure story, or I'm not good enough story, or I always get it wrong story, finding a way to kind of take the words and make them into something which is part of you, but is slightly separate, can be really helpful. So the second stage is naming. And then the third stage is need. Okay, and this is getting quite deep. But what I will work with clients on is to identify what that part of you really needs, and helping them to be compassionate with that part of themselves. Because often when that voice starts coming up, we hate it. We don't want it to be there. We're trying to push it away. We're trying to ignore it. And a bit like having a toddler. Like if you ignore a toddler, all it's going to do is be like, mummy, 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 louder, louder. It will start shouting louder. And so instead of pushing it away, we're actually looking at it with compassion and trying to understand what it needs in that moment, so that we can comfort it and move on and do the thing that we actually want to do. So let me just show you how that might work kind of in a coaching session. So noticing, so types of questions that you might ask. So what are the thoughts that your mind keeps repeating to you? How do you respond to these thoughts when they come up? And how does that work out for you? So you're just trying to help them understand, to see their inner critic, and to see the impact that when they connect with those thoughts, that impact that it has on them. So first stage is noticing. Then we're getting into naming. So it feels like those thoughts are connected to a deeper story. What might the title of that story be? So we're helping them to find a name for that story. Or if you were going to give a name to that part of yourself, what might you call it? And what do you normally do when you start to really connect with and believe that story? So again, we're helping them to see the impact of that story. And then we get into the needing. So how do you think that part of you is telling that story is feeling? How is that part of you feeling right now? How would you respond to a friend or a family member who is feeling that way? So we're trying to help that person to go, oh, actually, I would respond, in a compassionate way, in a helpful way, in a supportive way. What does that part of you need most from you right now? So again, we're trying to help a person identify and to be able to identify, maybe it's words, maybe it's some kind of comfort. So normally when I'm working with clients, we will come up with some words of comfort for that part of us. So it might be, it's okay. It's all going to be all right, which is quite a shift from where they've been before. So before with the inner critic, often we're like, I'm going to try and ignore it. I'm just going to try and tell it to F off, and I'm just going to get on with my stuff. So instead, we're going to take that part of ourselves and go, it's okay. I know you're scared. I know this feels really uncomfortable, but we're going to be all right. We can cope with this. So finding words of comfort for that part of ourselves when we hear those words come up. And yeah, so when this story comes up next time, what can you do that would be most helpful? So again, it's finding something that your client can practice to help them to live with their inner critic in a more skillful way, and then encouraging them to practice it. And again, I just wanted to raise, Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion is fantastic. And if you haven't come across it before, then I really recommend her book. But what we're looking for is a move from treating the self critic in us as something that is really negative and is something that we just wish wasn't there and wish it would go away, to something that we're accepting in ourselves and finding a way to show that part of ourselves some compassion, and therefore showing ourselves some compassion. So we're kind of killing it with love rather than trying to kill it dead, if that makes sense. So let's go back to my client who had the lovely Eeyore. So how is she? Hopefully now her interview will have finished now, and hopefully she was successful in this. But the practice that she took away from our session last week was that she was going to notice when those thoughts came up about her interview today, and she was going to tell Eeyore, it's okay to feel nervous. It's a really, really natural response. You don't need to worry. I'll be okay, whatever happens. And it's worth the discomfort because I want to do more in my job. So again, and I could talk loads more about this, but connecting with your values in that point could be really, really helpful. But she found 3 statements that just helped her to calm that part of her down, to not push it away, to let it know that it had been listened to, and to give it a bit of care. And hopefully that has worked today to support her to then, because what she wanted to do was focusing on prepping for her interview and doing the work that she needed and getting her head in the right place for her interview. She didn't want to be in a battle with her inner critic. She wanted to be focusing on the stuff that she really needed to do in order to prepare. But what she was finding that she was doing when she was kind of letting the inner critic in, letting Eeyore, get in and trying to push it away, she was getting into using lots of energy at fighting that part of herself. And this way, she was, through using these statements, she was practicing accepting that the inner critic was there, accepting Eeyore, and telling him that it was going to be okay. Oh, stop recording.